The bronchial tree is the term that we apply to the series of airways that arise after you pass through the trachea. If you look in the top right-hand corner of the image here, you'll see the pathway of the bronchial tree. By the time you finish your reviewing, you should understand and remember that pathway that you see above. So, the bronchial tree begins at the trachea. Once the trachea branches, it gives rise to two primary bronchi. The primary bronchi allow air to enter each lung. There's one primary bronchus on the left and one primary bronchus on the right, so you have the right and also left primary bronchus. Once again, they carry air to each lung respectively. Now the right and left primary bronchus, they are not equal. Although in the diagram it looks like both bronchi are splitting off equally, in reality this is not the case. The right primary bronchus emerges from the carina a little bit sooner than the left primary bronchus, so the right primary bronchus branches first. Additionally, the opening into the right primary bronchus is also a little bit wider. This leads to something that becomes very relevant clinically, at least, when people usually swallow something or aspirate something that enters their respiratory system. It usually, a majority of the time, will end up in the right primary bronchus. The reason is because it's just simply easier for that item to enter the right primary bronchus as opposed to the left. First of all, the opening to the right primary bronchus is wider. Secondly, it's the first bronchus that emerges, so it's just more difficult for that item to enter the left primary bronchus. So if somebody swallows or aspirates an item, it typically would end up within that right primary bronchus. The right primary bronchi give rise to, the primary bronchi in general give rise to secondary bronchi. Secondary bronchi will deliver air to each lobe of a lung. If you look, the lungs themselves are divided up into several large sections, several lobes respectively. The right lung has 1, 2, 3 lobes. The left lung has 1 and 2 lobes. So a secondary bronchus would be carrying air to each lobe of a lung. Next you have tertiary bronchi. Tertiary bronchi carry air towards smaller divisions within each lobe called lobules. That's L-O-B-U-L-E-S. Each lung lobule is supported by a tertiary bronchus. The tertiary bronchi then lead to bronchioles. Very important that you pay attention to the difference between a bronchi and a bronchiole. That's because bronchi, by definition, also have cartilage in their walls. If we take a look at a table we saw earlier during this chapter, you'll see that if you look at the structure of primary bronchi, it's a passageway for air, yes, but it also contains C-shaped rings of cartilage. Secondary bronchi also contains plates of cartilage. Tertiary bronchi contains plates of cartilage. However, when you begin to look at the description of bronchioles, smooth muscle has now become the dominant tissue. No longer do you see cartilage within the wall. And that brings me to a point of one of the very important structural changes that you see within the respiratory system as you go from the larger to the smaller airways. One of the major structural changes that arises is that the amount of cartilage will decrease and the amount of smooth muscle, relatively speaking, increases. All that's saying is that as you go from the trachea and proceed to the smaller airways, the amount of cartilage ultimately disappears, and that cartilage is going to be replaced with smooth muscle. Please keep that point in mind. Past the bronchioles, you would next have terminal bronchioles, as you saw here in the flow pattern. Terminal bronchioles are so named because they are the terminal bronchioles of the conducting zone. So that's where at least this concept of the bronchial tree terminates. It does continue the airways, at least, into the respiratory zone past the terminal bronchioles. So please, once again, keep in mind where each bronchus is carrying air. Also, the structural differences between the right and the left primary bronchus, and the structural differences between bronchioles and bronchi.